The telegram that summoned Lord Peter Wimsey to the wilds of Gloucestershire contained, in addition to the usual complement of murdered persons and baffled constabulary, a particularly egregious assault upon the English language that made him wince visibly over his morning kipper. Widow found dead ballroom. Midnight stop appeared to waltz herself to death. Stop local inspector quotes Browning incorrectly. Stop assistance urgently required. Stop Parker. "Good Lord," murmured Wimsey, adjusting his monocle with the precision of a man preparing to examine a particularly offensive specimen of bad grammar. Not only has someone managed to expire while executing what I can only assume was a particularly energetic past soul, but the local authorities have apparently confused Robert Browning with his considerably more talented wife. One hardly knows whether to pack one's dancing pumps or one's copy of sonnets from the Portuguese. Bunter, who had developed over the years an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his master's requirements in matters both sartorial and criminological, appeared at his elbow with a small leather valise and an expression of resigned competence. "I have taken the liberty of including your evening dress, my lord, in the event that the investigation should require participation in any recreational activities. Also, the portable gramophone and a selection of appropriate recordings, should demonstration prove necessary." "Bunter, you are a treasure beyond the dreams of avarice," Wimsey declared, rising from the breakfast table with the fluid grace of a man who had never in his life been required to hurry anywhere of genuine importance. "Though I confess myself somewhat puzzled by the notion of waltzing oneself to death, it suggests either a remarkably enthusiastic approach to the terpsichorean arts or a murderer with a distinctly theatrical turn of mind." The journey to Thornfield Manor proved to be a pleasant drive through the sort of autumn countryside that had been providing inspiration to second-rate poets for centuries. Ancient oaks blazed with amber and gold, while morning mist clung to the hedgerows with the persistence of a guilty conscience. Wimsey found himself humming a complex passage from a Bach partita, his fingers drumming the intricate counterpoint against the Daimler's leather upholstery as they wound through villages that appeared to have been arranged specifically for the benefit of watercolor enthusiasts and writers of detective fiction. Thornfield Manor, when it finally materialized through the morning haze, proved to be one of those substantial Georgian houses that managed to suggest both prosperity and a certain ominous melancholy. Its perfectly proportioned facade gazed out over immaculately maintained grounds, with the sort of blank, watchful expression that made one suspect the house of harboring secrets in its cellars and scandals in its attics. Inspector Parker was waiting in the gravelled forecourt, his usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled in a manner that suggested he had been dealing with rural constabulary and their creative interpretations of Victorian poetry for rather longer than his patience could comfortably accommodate. "Peter, thank heaven you've arrived," he said, striding forward with visible relief. "The local inspector has been regaling me with quotations from what he insists is Browning's 'How Do I Love Thee,' apparently under the impression that it contains some profound insight into the psychology of solitary dancing. I've heard more about counting the ways of love than I care to contemplate in a murder investigation." "Ah, but Charles, there lies your fundamental error," Wimsey replied, stepping down from the motor car with the careful precision of a man who considered every movement a small performance worthy of an appreciative audience. The good inspector was undoubtedly thinking of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's immortal sonnet, which begins, "How do I love thee?" Let me count the ways. A perfectly understandable confusion, though it does rather suggest that our local representatives of law and order have been spending more time in the lending library's romance section than among the criminal statutes. Parker's expression conveyed the weary resignation of a man who had long since ceased to be surprised by his friend's ability to find intellectual amusement in the most inappropriate circumstances. The victim is Mrs. Venetia Thornfield, aged 47, widow of the late Colonel Thornfield. She was discovered this morning by her housekeeper in the ballroom, apparently having died while dancing alone sometime after the stroke of midnight. Dancing alone at midnight, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully, his pale eyes acquiring that peculiar intensity that Parker had learned to associate with the beginning of one of his friend's more elaborate intellectual exercises. How perfectly extraordinary, and how perfectly melancholy. There's something rather gothic about a widow waltzing with invisible partners in the small hours, don't you think? Rather like something from a particularly morbid fairy tale, or perhaps a cautionary story about the dangers of excessive devotion to the terpsichorean arts. They were met at the front door by a butler whose funereal expression suggested that he had been practicing for this particular tragedy for the better part of his professional career. His name, he informed them with the sort of dignity that comes from a lifetime of announcing unpleasant news to persons of quality, was Meadows, and he had been in service at Thornfield Manor for the better part of 30 years. "If you would be so kind as to follow me, my lord," Meadows intoned, leading them through a series of corridors decorated with portraits of Thornfield ancestors, who appeared to have been uniformly blessed with strong jaws and suspicious dispositions. "Mrs. Thornfield that is to say, her ladyship remains in the ballroom, as Inspector Grimsby felt it best to disturb nothing until your arrival." The ballroom, when they finally reached it, proved to be a magnificent chamber that had clearly been designed with an eye toward impressing the neighbors and intimidating the servants. Tall windows looked out over formal gardens, while an ornate ceiling depicted various mythological figures engaged in what appeared to be a perpetual, celestial dance. The polished parquet floor stretched like a golden sea between walls lined with gilt mirrors that reflected and re-reflected the morning light, until the entire room seemed to shimmer with an almost supernatural radiance. In the precise center of this glittering expanse lay Mrs. Venetia Thornfield. She was arranged with a peculiar, almost artistic precision that immediately caught Whimsy's attention. Her evening gown, a creation of midnight blue silk that had clearly been designed by someone with both taste and a substantial budget, was spread around her in perfect symmetry. Her arms were extended gracefully, as if she had been caught in mid-waltz, while her face wore an expression of such serene contentment that one might have supposed her to be merely resting between dances. "Rigor mortis?" Whimsy inquired, circling the body with the careful attention of a connoisseur examining a particularly interesting piece of sculpture. "Fully established, my lord," replied Dr. Hartwell, the local physician, who had been hovering near the windows with the air of a man who wished himself anywhere else. "Death occurred sometime between 11 o'clock and 1 in the morning, I should estimate. No obvious signs of violence, though there are certain peculiarities." "Ah," said Whimsy, adjusting his monocle and peering more closely at the deceased. "Peculiarities are always so much more interesting than straightforward strangulation or bludgeoning, don't you find? Pray elaborate, Doctor." "Well, my lord, there's the matter of the positioning. Mrs. Thornfield appears to have died in what I can only describe as a perfect waltz pose. Arms extended, weight balanced, even her expression. It's as if she simply stopped dancing and never started again." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully, his gaze moving from the body to the gramophone that stood silent in one corner of the room, its brass horn gleaming like a golden flower in the morning light. Near it, scattered across a small table, lay several gramophone records and what appeared to be a dance card, though who might have been expected to sign such a document at a solitary midnight ball remained unclear. "Most illuminating," he murmured, then turned to Inspector Grimsby, a stout, red-faced gentleman whose expression suggested that he found the entire business deeply offensive to his sense of proper order. "I don't suppose, Inspector, that you've had occasion to examine the gramophone mechanism? Or perhaps to inquire whether Mrs. Thornfield was in the habit of conducting midnight dance recitals?" "Well, my lord," Grimsby began uncertainly, "the servants say she often came down here late at night. Said she liked to practice her steps when the house was quiet. As for the gramophone, well, there's a record still on the turntable, though it's not playing, of course." Whimsy approached the machine with the reverent attention of an archaeologist examining a particularly significant artifact. The record bore a label in elegant script, "The Blue Danube Waltz, Victor Herbert Orchestra." The needle arm was positioned at the very end of the recording, as if the music had played through to its conclusion before stopping. "Curious," he observed, lifting the needle with careful fingers and examining its point. "Tell me, Inspector, was the gramophone playing when Mrs. Thornfield was discovered?" "No, my lord." Silent as the grave, if you'll pardon the expression. "And yet," Whimsy continued, his voice taking on that particular tone of quiet satisfaction that Parker recognized as the harbinger of revelation, "the needle shows clear signs of recent use. See here, where the point has been worn slightly. This machine was definitely in operation last night." He straightened, his pale eyes moving around the room with renewed interest, taking in details that had previously escaped notice. The faint scuff marks on the polished floor that traced the pattern of a waltz, the single white rose that lay wilted near the French doors, the grandfather clock in the corner that had stopped at precisely 12 minutes past midnight. "Bunter," he called softly, and his valet appeared as if summoned by some form of domestic telepathy. "I believe we shall require the camera. And do be particularly careful to capture the positioning of that clock and the pattern of those scuff marks on the floor. Something tells me that Mrs. Thornfield's final dance was considerably more complex than it initially appeared." As Bunter set about his photographic duties with the quiet efficiency of a man who had documented more crime scenes than most Scotland Yard inspectors, Whimsy turned to Parker with a smile that was equal parts amusement and anticipation. "My dear Charles," he said, adjusting his tie with the precise attention to detail that characterized all his movements, "I do believe we are about to encounter one of those delightfully intricate puzzles that make murder so much more intellectually stimulating than, say, stamp collecting or the breeding of prize roses. Mrs. Thornfield may indeed have danced herself to death, but I rather suspect that she had some assistance in choreographing her final performance." The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the mirrors lining the ballroom walls, creating a kaleidoscope of reflected images that made the empty room seem suddenly, eerily populated with phantom dancers. And in that shifting play of light and shadow, Whimsy found himself wondering, not just who had killed Venetia Thornfield, but why they had chosen to do so with such an elaborate and theatrical flourish. The dance, it seemed, was just beginning. The servants of Thornfield Manor arranged themselves in the drawing-room with that particular combination of deference and barely concealed curiosity that Whimsy had learned to associate with households where violent death had disrupted the careful choreography of domestic routine. Meadows, summoned first by virtue of his position, presented himself with the sort of dignified composure that suggested he had been practicing for precisely this sort of interview throughout his 30-year tenure. Mrs. Thornfield was indeed in the habit of conducting her dancing practice in the evening hours, he confirmed, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man accustomed to delivering information without editorial comment. "Generally between the hours of 10 and midnight, my lord. She found the solitude conducive to concentration, she said, and preferred not to disturb the household with her musical selections." "And last evening?" Whimsy inquired, settling himself into a chair with the casual precision of a man preparing to conduct a particularly delicate experiment. "You observed nothing unusual in her demeanor or routine?" "Nothing whatsoever, my lord." "I served her coffee in the library at 9:30, as was customary. She mentioned that she intended to practice later, once the house had settled. I retired at my usual hour of 11:15, having secured the doors and windows according to established procedure." Mrs. Baines, the housekeeper, proved somewhat more forthcoming, though her testimony introduced the first of several puzzling contradictions that would come to characterize the evening's events. A woman of evident competence, whose starched apron seemed to serve as both uniform and armor, she spoke with the authority of one who had made it her business to know everything that occurred within the manor's walls. I was attending to the linen cupboards until well past midnight, my lord, on account of the new girl having muddled the inventory. At precisely 12 minutes past 12, I noted the time because the hall clock has a particularly distinctive chime, I heard what I can only describe as an abrupt cessation of sound from the direction of the ballroom wing. Not a gradual fading, you understand, but a sudden silence, as if someone had simply lifted the needle from a gramophone record. Whimsy's pale eyes sharpened with interest. You're quite certain of the timing, Mrs. Baines, and the nature of the sound's termination? Absolutely certain, my lord. I pride myself on precision in such matters. Agnes, Mrs. Thornfield's personal maid, introduced an even more perplexing element to the evening's chronology. A nervous young woman whose hands seemed incapable of remaining still, she provided testimony that would prove central to Whimsy's eventual understanding of the case. I assisted Mrs. Thornfield into her grey silk wrapper at 10:15, my lord, after she had dismissed me for the evening. She specifically requested the grey, saying it was more suitable for practice than her formal evening wear. But this morning, Agnes's voice faltered slightly. This morning she was discovered wearing the midnight blue ball gown, the one I had laid out for mending on account of a torn hem. You're quite certain about the grey wrapper? Parker interjected, his pencil poised over his notebook. Absolutely certain, sir. I would never mistake such a detail. It's my responsibility to know precisely what Mrs. Thornfield wears. James, the footman, contributed his own observations about the evening's timeline, though his account introduced yet another puzzling discrepancy. I carried Mrs. Thornfield's evening tea to the drawing-room at 9:25, my lord. She seemed excited, I suppose one might say. Kept humming under her breath and checking the mantelpiece clock. Said she had an important lesson that evening and wanted everything to be perfect. A lesson? Whimsy's monocle gleamed as he leaned forward with renewed attention. Did Mrs. Thornfield regularly receive instruction in dancing? James coloured slightly. Not exactly instruction, my lord. At least, not from anyone who came to the house. But she did correspond regularly with someone she called her professor of the dance. Letters arrived weekly, always in the same handwriting, always marked private and confidential. Following these interviews, Whimsy returned to the ballroom for a more systematic examination of the gramophone and its acoustic properties. The machine, he discovered, had been extensively modified with additional resonating chambers and a sophisticated volume control mechanism that suggested someone had invested considerable effort in achieving precise acoustic effects. Observe, Charles, he said, winding the gramophone's spring mechanism and timing its operation with his pocket watch. This particular recording of the Blue Danube plays for exactly 4 minutes and 27 seconds. The automatic stop mechanism brings the turntable to a gradual halt over the course of several seconds. Hardly the abrupt cessation that Mrs. Baines described with such precision. He moved to the center of the ballroom and clapped his hands sharply, listening to the way the sound traveled around the room's mirrored walls and painted ceiling. The acoustic properties are quite remarkable. A person dancing here would indeed hear echoes of their own movements, creating the illusion of invisible partners. Most fascinating from a psychological perspective. Parker watched as his friend examined the gramophone's needle arm with a magnifying glass, noting the particular pattern of wear that suggested recent, extensive use. So we have a machine that stops gradually, but a witness who heard it stop abruptly. Woman dressed in grey, who was found in blue, and a correspondence with a mysterious dance instructor who may or may not exist. Precisely, Whimsy murmured, straightening with that particular expression of quiet satisfaction that Parker had learned to associate with the beginning of one of his more elaborate deductions. We have, in short, a collection of contradictions that suggests last evening's performance was considerably more complex than a simple case of solitary dancing. Someone, it would appear, took great care to orchestrate Mrs. Thornfield's final waltz. though whether as participant or observer remains to be determined. The gramophone sat silent in its corner, its brass horn gleaming like a golden throat that had swallowed secrets along with songs, while somewhere in the depths of Thornfield Manor the truth waited to be uncovered like a dancer, frozen mid-step, ready to resume a performance that had been interrupted by death itself. The discovery that would elevate the investigation from curious incident to apparent murder most foul emerged from Mrs. Baines's methodical search through Mrs. Thornfield's private papers. Armed with the duplicate key that Bunter had located behind the library skirting board, she produced a leather portfolio containing correspondence that Inspector Grimsby immediately declared damning evidence of the most conclusive sort. The letters, written in a bold, masculine hand that betrayed both education and mounting desperation, chronicled a steady deterioration in familial relations that seemed to provide the missing motive for what had previously appeared inexplicable. Captain Roderick Thornfield, stepson to the deceased and sole heir to the considerable Thornfield estate, had apparently been conducting an increasingly acrimonious correspondence with his stepmother over the past 6 months. "My dear stepmother," read the earliest missive, dated in spring, "I find myself in temporary financial embarrassment and would be most grateful for a modest advance against my eventual inheritance. £500 would resolve certain pressing obligations most satisfactorily." The subsequent letters painted a portrait of progressive desperation. Within 3 months, polite requests had transformed into urgent demands, while the sums mentioned had grown from hundreds to thousands of pounds. The penmanship itself seemed to deteriorate with each exchange, as if the writer's composure was unraveling along with his financial circumstances. "You persist in treating me as if I were some common fortune hunter," declared one particularly heated letter dated merely 2 weeks previous, "rather than your late husband's son. The inheritance you control so jealously will be mine eventually. Would it not be wiser to release a portion now, while your cooperation might still be remembered with gratitude?" But it was the final communication, dated just 3 days before Mrs. Thornfield's death, that caused Inspector Grimsby to declare the case essentially solved. Written in a hand that betrayed both intoxication and fury, it abandoned all pretense of filial respect. "Your midnight dancing sessions provide no sanctuary from the consequences of your selfishness," the captain had written. "Even widows who waltz alone must eventually face the music. Do not imagine I will continue dancing attendance while you keep me waiting indefinitely." The reference to Mrs. Thornfield's nocturnal habits struck Whimsy as particularly significant, suggesting intimate knowledge of routines that should have been private. When Captain Thornfield himself arrived at the manor, summoned by telegram but appearing with suspicious promptness, he presented a figure that seemed almost deliberately designed to confirm every suspicion of guilt. Tall and burnished, with the bearing of a professional soldier gone slightly to seed, he carried the faint aroma of Turkish tobacco and what appeared to be traces of playing card paste on his left cuff. His boots bore the distinctive crescent marks of recently applied brakes, suggesting hasty travel, while his manner combined grief with a peculiar undercurrent of relief that struck even Parker as distinctly suspicious. "Cheltenham," he announced when questioned about his whereabouts the previous evening. "The races, supper at the Falcon, cards until well past 1 o'clock. Mr. Larkin and Captain Viner will confirm it." "Yet you arrived here with remarkable alacrity," Whimsy observed mildly, "for someone who supposedly learned of the tragedy only this morning." Bunter's methodical search of the waste-paper baskets had meanwhile yielded additional evidence in the form of a torn memorandum bearing penciled notations. 11:50 call, let it ring music until stop. The timing corresponded suspiciously with Mrs. Baines's testimony about the abrupt cessation of sound at 12 minutes past 12. "A motor can cover the distance from Cheltenham in 35 minutes, Inspector Grimsby noted with satisfaction, driven by someone with urgent business and little regard for safety. When confronted with his threatening correspondence, Captain Thornfield showed no inclination toward denial. Instead, he seemed almost eager to elaborate upon his grievances, painting his stepmother as a miserly guardian who had systematically frustrated his legitimate expectations. "She doled out allowances as if I were still a schoolboy," he declared, his voice rising with indignation, "lectured me about responsibility as if she had any right to judge my conduct. Well, she's learned that there are consequences to treating a gentleman's son like a common beggar." Most damning of all was his reaction to news of the death itself. Rather than expressing shock or grief, he had responded with what could only be described as satisfaction. Always said that dancing nonsense would be the death of her, prancing about like some demented ballerina at her age. It was bound to end badly. Yet Whimsy, rather than sharing Inspector Grimsby's evident satisfaction with this convenient solution, appeared to grow increasingly thoughtful. His examination of the gramophone revealed needlewear consistent with multiple recordings, though only one disc remained on the table. The hotel stationery bearing Bath watermarks, yet posted from Cheltenham, suggested either extensive travel or deliberate misdirection. "Tell me, Captain," Whimsy said suddenly, "you seem remarkably unsurprised by your stepmother's demise. Might one inquire whether you anticipated such an event?" "Heart couldn't take the strain forever," Roderick replied with drunken confidence. "Woman her age, excessive exertion, obvious really." "How remarkably prescient," Whimsy murmured, "to diagnose heart failure before the physician has completed his examination." The red herring had arrived precisely on schedule, complete with motive, opportunity, and what amounted to a confession. Yet something in the very convenience of this solution seemed to amuse rather than satisfy Lord Peter Whimsy, as if Captain Thornfield's apparent guilt had merely added another layer of complexity to an already elaborate puzzle. The very convenience of Inspector Grimsby's solution, letters sufficiently incriminating to satisfy a magistrate, a stepson with gambling debts and suspicious timing, threats that bordered on confession, seemed to afford Lord Peter Whimsy considerable amusement. Rather than joining the inspector's satisfied contemplation of Captain Thornfield's guilt, he embarked upon what appeared to be an entirely frivolous examination of matters that bore no conceivable relationship to murder. "Mrs. Baines," he began, retrieving the ivory dance card from the gramophone table and examining it through his monocle with the concentrated attention of a biblical scholar. "I find myself curious about the protocols surrounding such formalities. Would Mrs. Thornfield have maintained proper dance card etiquette even for solitary practice?" The housekeeper's expression suggested she found the inquiry distinctly peculiar. "Mrs. Thornfield was most particular about maintaining standards, my lord, even in private matters. She often said that practice without proper form was merely exercise." Whimsy studied the elegant script that filled the card's ivory leaves. "And this handwriting, unmistakably hers." "Oh yes, my lord. She always wrote out her practice sessions as if they were actual engagements. Waltz with the professor, advanced variations, that sort of thing." "Most illuminating," Whimsy murmured, noting the faint impressions where a pencil had pressed rather firmly against the delicate surface. "One observes that someone wrote with considerable emphasis. Excitement, perhaps, or determination." His next investigation proved equally mystifying to the assembled company. He spent nearly 20 minutes examining the ballroom carpet with the intensity of an archaeologist studying ancient pottery, tracing patterns in the Persian weave that corresponded to the scuff marks left by dancing feet. "Bunter, do measure the distance between these heel marks. Note particularly the depth of impression near the gramophone as compared to the center of the room." His valet produced a measuring tape with customary efficiency, recording dimensions that seemed to follow no apparent logic. "The impressions grow progressively deeper approaching the center, my lord, then become quite shallow again near the perimeter." "Precisely what one might expect from a waltz," Whimsy observed, though he declined to elaborate on what such a pattern might indicate. Parker watched with growing fascination as Whimsy turned his attention to the grandfather clock that had stopped at precisely 12 minutes past midnight. The magnificent timepiece, with its ebony case and brass fittings, had presumably kept accurate time for generations. "Tell me, Meadows," Whimsy said, circling the clock with predatory attention, "is this instrument generally reliable? Does it require frequent adjustment?" "Most precise mechanism, my lord. Wound every Sunday without fail, keeps perfect time throughout the week." Mrs. Thornfield was most particular about punctuality. And yet it stopped last evening at 12 minutes past 12. Whimsy opened the clock case and examined the pendulum mechanism with horological precision. "Bunter, observe this carefully." The pendulum showed a small obstruction, a thread of dark blue silk caught in the mechanism's delicate works. Someone, Whimsy noted with satisfaction, required this clock to stop at a very specific moment. Moving to the gramophone, he lifted the needle and examined its point under his magnifying glass. "This needle has been changed recently. The wear pattern is inconsistent with extended use. Someone replaced it within the past day." "But why change a gramophone needle?" Inspector Grimsby asked, his confidence beginning to show strain. "An excellent question," Whimsy replied, testing the machine's acoustic properties by positioning himself at various points around the room. "Why indeed require a fresh needle for routine practice? Unless the evening was neither routine nor solitary." He tapped lightly against one of the gilt mirrors, listening to the sounds travel through the room's acoustic properties. Remarkable resonance, wouldn't you agree? One could quite imagine achieving very specific sound effects with proper positioning and timing. Agnes, who had been watching these proceedings with bewilderment, finally ventured, "Begging your pardon, my lord, but what do dance cards and carpet patterns have to do with poor Mrs. Thornfield's death?" Whimsy turned with that particular smile Parker had learned to associate with approaching revelation. "My dear Agnes, they have everything to do with it. A waltz is not merely a dance. It is a precise, mathematical relationship between music, movement, and time. When someone dies while waltzing, one must consider not merely the dancer, but the entire choreography of the evening." The grandfather clock's steady ticking resumed as Bunter carefully removed the silk obstruction, marking time that seemed suddenly pregnant with significance. Somewhere in the accumulating details of dance cards and gramophone needles, carpet impressions and acoustic properties, the true choreography of Mrs. Thornfield's final performance was beginning to emerge from shadow into light, revealing a complexity that made Captain Thornfield's crude threats seem almost laughably inadequate to the elegant precision of the actual crime. The very precision with which Inspector Grimsby had assembled his case against Captain Thornfield seemed to afford Whimsy considerable intellectual satisfaction, though not perhaps for the reasons the inspector might have hoped. Armed with his pocket watch, measuring tape, and that particular expression of polite skepticism that Parker had learned to associate with the demolition of seemingly unassailable theories, he embarked upon a systematic reconstruction of the previous evening's events. "Let us begin with the immutable facts," Whimsy announced, positioning himself in the library where Mrs. Thornfield had received her final cup of coffee. "Time, distance, and the physical limitations of the human form, these, unlike witness testimony, cannot be persuaded to accommodate convenient theories." Bunter produced a detailed floor plan of the manor, upon which Whimsy began plotting movements with the precision of a military strategist. Coffee served at 9:30. Library to ballroom represents 43 measured paces. At a lady's walking pace, accounting for evening dress and proper deportment, approximately 2 minutes of travel time. The first significant contradiction emerged from Agnes's testimony regarding Mrs. Thornfield's attire. The grey wrapper at 10:15, Whimsy noted, yet discovered in the midnight blue ball gown. "Agnes, you've mentioned this particular gown requires assistance to fasten properly." "Impossible to manage alone, my lord," Agnes confirmed nervously. 15 hooks running the full length of the spine, each requiring precise alignment. I've dressed Mrs. Thornfield for years. She could never have managed those fastenings without help. Yet no one admits to providing such assistance, Wimsey observed, marking this impossibility on his timeline. The garment requires approximately 8 minutes to don properly, assuming experienced help. Without assistance, the task becomes virtually impossible. Moving to the ballroom, Wimsey conducted what appeared to be an elaborate acoustic experiment. He positioned Bunter at the gramophone while testing sound patterns from various positions around the room. Charles, observe carefully. The music reaches different areas at subtly different times, creating echo effects that could, with proper positioning, produce the illusion of multiple sound sources. More significantly, he discovered that certain positions near the mirrored walls created what he termed acoustic shadows, areas where even loud music became mysteriously muffled. One could conceivably remain concealed behind this decorative column, he demonstrated, effectively invisible to someone dancing in the center of the room. The gramophone itself yielded fascinating evidence under closer examination. Wimsey lifted a small brass fitting near the horn's throat, revealing a sliding baffle mechanism. Observe, Charles. Close this vein, and the corridor hears nothing, though the record continues playing faithfully within the room. The experiment proved illuminating. With the baffle closed, Mrs. Baines, positioned at her linen cupboard, heard only faint whispers of sound. "Exactly what I heard at 12 minutes past 12, she confirmed. An abrupt cessation, as if someone had simply lifted the needle. Yet the gramophone's automatic mechanism produces a gradual fade, Wimsey noted. For Mrs. Baines to perceive an abrupt cessation, someone would need to manipulate this baffle manually. But the timing suggests something far more sophisticated than simple needle lifting. The grandfather clock presented equally intriguing evidence. Examination of the pendulum mechanism revealed not merely the silk thread Bunter had discovered, but traces of beeswax and graphite suggesting an elaborate timing device. Weights and pulleys, Wimsey murmured, can be made to perform quite complex choreography when properly arranged. Captain Thornfield's alibi crumbled under systematic analysis. The distance from Cheltenham could indeed be covered in 35 minutes, but only under ideal conditions. The roads were damp last evening, Bunter reported after examining tire tracks. No evidence of the reckless driving necessary for such timing. More damning still, the captain's motor car showed an odometer reading inconsistent with a round trip to Cheltenham, approximately 40 miles fewer than such a journey would require. Either our captain possesses supernatural powers of locomotion, Wimsey observed dryly, or his alibi requires revision. The locked ballroom itself presented the most fascinating puzzle. Both the main doors and French windows showed evidence of being secured from within, yet Mrs. Thornfield could not have accomplished this after her own death. The French windows opened onto a terrace 15 feet above flagstone paving, possible to descend, but requiring considerable athletic ability and presenting substantial risk of injury. "We are dealing," Wimsey announced, his pale eyes bright with intellectual excitement. "Not with a straightforward case of inheritance murder, but with an elaborate performance requiring intimate knowledge of Mrs. Thornfield's habits, precise timing, and considerable theatrical skill." The chronology that emerged bore little resemblance to Inspector Grimsby's simple narrative. Instead of a stepson breaking in to murder his stepmother, the evidence suggested something far more psychologically complex. A crime that had been choreographed as carefully as any ballet, with the locked ballroom serving as stage for a performance that had culminate in death. Someone, Wimsey concluded, studying his accumulated notes with satisfaction, understood not merely Mrs. Thornfield's routines, but her deepest psychological vulnerabilities. The question now becomes, who possessed such intimate knowledge, and how did they persuade her to participate in her own final dance? The locked room had indeed witnessed murder, but the performance had been far more sophisticated than anyone had initially imagined. Somewhere in the accumulating contradictions lay the key to understanding how a woman could die alone in a secured ballroom while surrounded by evidence of elaborate conspiracy. The answer to who possessed such intimate knowledge of Mrs. Thornfield's psychology emerged from Bunter's methodical examination of her private escritoire, where a concealed compartment behind the lower drawer yielded what would prove to be the most illuminating evidence in the entire investigation. The cache of correspondence discovered there, tied with faded blue ribbon and arranged with the meticulous precision that characterized all of Mrs. Thornfield's activities, painted a portrait of psychological manipulation so subtle and comprehensive that even Wimsey found himself momentarily speechless. The letters, spanning nearly 2 decades, bore the letterhead of one who identified himself variously as Professor Augustin Moreau, Herr Dr. Weiss, and ultimately simply as the Professor of the Dance. The earliest missives, dating to shortly after Colonel Thornfield's death, presented themselves as conventional responses to a widow's inquiry about private dancing instruction, written in an elegant continental hand that suggested both education and European origins. "My dear Mrs. Thornfield," read the first letter, "your inquiry regarding the classical forms of ballroom dance demonstrates admirable dedication to the cultivation of grace. The waltz, as you have correctly observed, represents not merely physical movement, but a dialogue between souls conducted through the medium of music and mathematical precision. What had begun as seemingly legitimate instruction had evolved over the course of years into something far more psychologically complex and ultimately sinister. Wimsey's examination revealed a gradual shift in tone and content as technical guidance transformed into philosophical discourse, then into deeply personal observations about Mrs. Thornfield's emotional state and spiritual needs. The solitary waltz, declared one particularly revealing letter dated 5 years previous, represents the purest form of terpsichorean expression. When one dances alone, unobserved and unencumbered by the limitations of mortal partners, one achieves communion with the eternal rhythms that govern existence itself. Your midnight sessions have evolved beyond mere practice. They have become a form of sacred ritual. The correspondence revealed that this mysterious professor had never actually visited Thornfield Manor, conducting his instruction entirely through an elaborate system of written choreographic notation accompanied by specific gramophone recordings that he selected and provided. Mrs. Thornfield's dancing had been guided through remote manipulation, with the professor claiming to observe her progress through what he termed spiritual attunement to the universal dance. Agnes, when questioned about her mistress's correspondence habits, confirmed the religious regularity with which these letters arrived. "She treasured those letters, my lord, read them over and over, sometimes copying out passages in her own hand. Said the professor understood her artistic soul better than anyone living or dead." A small leather-bound journal, discovered alongside the correspondence, provided Mrs. Thornfield's own perspective on this increasingly abstract tutelage. Her entries revealed growing devotion to the professor's philosophy, struggles to achieve what he termed absolute presence, and a profound sense of connection to this unseen mentor who seemed to understand her deepest artistic yearnings. "The professor teaches me to choreograph my own existence," she had written in a trembling hand, "to make every movement a statement, every silence a profound pause. He says my waltz must become my legacy, my final gift to the world of true art." The psychological manipulation had been subtle, insidious, building systematically over 2 decades. The professor had cultivated Mrs. Thornfield's vanity, her desire for perfection, and most crucially, her isolation following the colonel's death. He had convinced her that only he truly understood her artistic potential, that mundane relationships and worldly concerns were mere distractions from her true calling. The recent correspondence grew increasingly urgent and specific about Mrs. Thornfield's midnight practices. The final letter, dated just 1 week before her death, contained detailed instructions for what he termed the ultimate performance, a culminating tableau that would represent the apotheosis of her artistic development. Tomorrow evening, at the stroke of midnight, you must perform the complete Viennese cycle while wearing your finest ball gown, the midnight blue silk that represents the very essence of nocturnal beauty, the professor had written. Remember that true artistic expression requires absolute solitude. The ballroom doors must remain locked to prevent interruption, and you must dance until the music reaches its natural conclusion. Bunter's examination of the gramophone records revealed that several bore labels in the same handwriting as the professor's letters, while microscopic analysis showed that some recordings had been altered, additional grooves cut into the wax to extend or modify the original music. A small silver metronome, discovered among the dance accessories, bore instructions to maintain Blue Danube tempo at precisely 66 beats per minute, steady as a devoted heart. "We are dealing," Whimsy announced, studying the accumulated correspondence with growing fascination. "Not with simple murder for inheritance, but with an elaborate psychological seduction conducted over decades. Someone has systematically transformed Mrs. Thornfield's innocent interest in dancing into a form of psychological dependency, gradually preparing her for what he convinced her would be the ultimate artistic expression. The portrait that emerged was of a lonely widow who had been gradually isolated from normal human contact through the influence of a correspondent who claimed to understand her artistic soul. This mysterious professor had become Mrs. Thornfield's primary emotional relationship, conducting an elaborate courtship through letters and musical selections that had culminated in her willing participation in her own carefully choreographed death. The locked ballroom suddenly seemed less like a crime scene than a stage where a meticulously orchestrated performance had reached its tragic conclusion, with Mrs. Thornfield as both leading lady and unwitting victim in a drama that someone else had been directing from the shadows for nearly 20 years. The question now became not merely who had killed her, but how they had managed to be present to orchestrate the final, fatal performance in a room that remained impossibly secured from within. The revelation of Mrs. Thornfield's psychological manipulation through the professor's correspondence had provided crucial insight, but it was Whimsy's return to the ballroom's physical properties that would reveal how such elaborate mental conditioning had culminated in actual murder. Armed with a deeper understanding of the victim's mindset, he approached the acoustic evidence with renewed systematic precision. "Bunter," he announced, positioning himself near the gramophone while studying the room's mirrored walls with the intensity of a military strategist. "I require a comprehensive mapping of this chamber's sound properties. We shall conduct what I believe the Germans would term a Schallanalyse, though I suspect our purposes are rather more criminological than musical." The gramophone itself yielded the first significant discovery under closer examination. Behind the brass horn's decorative throat, Whimsy discovered a sliding baffle mechanism that had been virtually invisible during initial inspection. The device, operated by a small lever concealed beneath the turntable, could dramatically alter the machine's acoustic output without affecting the record's actual playback. "Observe, Charles." Whimsy demonstrated, adjusting the baffle while Bunter operated the gramophone from across the room. With this vein fully open, the music projects normally throughout the chamber. Close it partially, and the sound becomes directional, focused. Close it entirely. He slid the mechanism to its final position, and the music becomes audible only to someone standing in immediate proximity to the horn itself. The implications became clear when they recreated Mrs. Baines's position in the linen cupboard. With the baffle open, she could hear the waltz clearly. When Whimsy suddenly closed it at precisely 12 minutes past the hour, matching the grandfather clock's testimony, the effect was startling. To Mrs. Baines, the music ceased abruptly, as if someone had lifted the needle mid-song. Yet within the ballroom, the recording continued playing, audible only in a narrow acoustic zone near the gramophone. Your abrupt cessation, Mrs. Baines, was perfectly accurate from your position, Whimsy explained gently. Someone manipulated this baffle at exactly the moment you specified, creating the illusion that the music had ended while it actually continued for those positioned differently within the room. Bunter's methodical examination of the mechanism revealed traces of the same beeswax and graphite combination they had discovered in the grandfather clock's pendulum assembly. More significantly, a tiny nick in the baffle's edge showed signs of recent modification, a deliberate notch that would allow the mechanism to be operated remotely using a thin wire or thread. The missing gramophone needle, which had puzzled Whimsy from the beginning, was discovered by Bunter beneath the French window's heavy curtains. The steel point was bent and bore traces of the same waxy residue, along with microscopic fibers that matched Mrs. Thornfield's midnight blue ball gown. Chemical analysis revealed that the needle had been deliberately stressed, filed to create a weakness that would cause it to snap at the record's conclusion. Someone replaced this damaged needle with a fresh one, Whimsy observed, examining both specimens through his magnifying glass. The original was designed to fail catastrophically at the recording's end, producing a sharp, percussive sound that would echo through the ballroom's acoustic chambers. From Mrs. Baines's position, this sudden noise, followed by the baffle's closure, would create the perfect illusion of abrupt musical cessation. A more thorough search revealed additional evidence of elaborate preparation. Behind the largest mirror, positioned to provide an unobstructed view of the ballroom's center, Bunter discovered a small observation platform bearing clear signs of recent occupancy. Scuff marks from leather shoes, traces of Turkish tobacco ash, and microscopic threads from expensive wool suggested someone had maintained a lengthy vigil from this concealed position. Our mysterious professor was indeed present for Mrs. Thornfield's final performance, Whimsy announced with growing satisfaction. He observed from concealment while manipulating both the acoustic environment and the timing of events through his elaborate mechanical preparations. The acoustic experiments revealed even more sophisticated manipulation. Certain positions within the ballroom created what acousticians termed phantom echoes, reflected sounds that appeared to originate from entirely different locations. Using the room's mirrored surfaces and painted ceiling as resonating chambers, someone positioned behind the concealment could whisper instructions that would seem to emanate from the air itself, around a dancer positioned in the room's center. Agnes's testimony about Mrs. Thornfield's excitement regarding the professor's promised attendance now took on sinister significance. The widow had believed she would finally meet her mentor face to face, when in reality, he had been orchestrating her death from the shadows while maintaining the illusion of supernatural guidance through carefully manipulated acoustics. We are dealing with someone who understood not merely psychology, but physics, Whimsy concluded, studying his accumulated evidence with the satisfaction of a mathematician completing a complex proof. Someone who could use sound itself as both weapon and alibi, creating precise timing through mechanical manipulation while remaining safely concealed throughout the entire performance. The bent needle with its waxy residue, the modified baffle with its remote operation capability, the observation platform with its evidence of lengthy occupation, all pointed to a crime of extraordinary sophistication. The professor had not merely convinced Mrs. Thornfield to dance herself to death. He had engineered the very mechanism by which that death would occur, using her beloved music as both lure and executioner. The locked ballroom mystery was resolving into something far more elaborate than simple inheritance murder. This was psychological manipulation, elevated to the level of mechanical precision, a crime that had transformed the victim's greatest passion into the instrument of her own destruction. The question now became not merely who possessed such knowledge, but how they had gained such intimate access to both Mrs. Thornfield's mind and Thornfield Manor's acoustic secrets. The accumulated evidence demanded not mere explanation, but theatrical demonstration, and Whimsy with that particular combination of intellectual precision and dramatic instinct that characterized his most successful investigations, announced his intention to recreate the fatal performance at precisely midnight. The ballroom, he declared, would serve once again as stage for a waltz, though this time the dance would reveal rather than conceal the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the assembled company as the grandfather clock approached the fatal hour, "we shall conduct what I believe the Germans would term a tattletry construction, though our purposes are rather more revelatory than academic. Bunter, if you would be so kind as to prepare our mechanical chorus." The participants arranged themselves according to Whimsy's precise choreography. Mrs. Baines returned to her linen cupboard, door ajar as it had been on the fatal evening. Agnes positioned herself near the French windows, while Meadows occupied his customary station by the main entrance. Captain Thornfield, despite his protests about the proceedings' irregularity, was assigned a chair near the grandfather clock where his nervous fidgeting could be observed without interference. Bunter, with the methodical efficiency of a stage manager preparing for a particularly delicate performance, had restored the gramophone to its exact configuration from the fatal evening. The baffle mechanism gleamed behind the brass horn, while the deliberately weakened needle, prepared according to the same specifications as the original, waited in position. The grandfather clock had been reset, its pendulum swinging with measured precision toward the appointed hour. "At 11:50 precisely," Whimsy announced, consulting his pocket watch with ceremonial attention. Mrs. Thornfield entered this ballroom believing she was about to meet her professor, face to face for the culmination of 20 years' correspondence. She was excited, nervous, perhaps trembling with anticipation of finally achieving the artistic transcendence he had promised. The gramophone began its haunting melody, filling the chamber with the same waltz that had accompanied Mrs. Thornfield's death. Whimsy moved to the room's center, not dancing but walking through the precise choreography that the carpet's wear patterns had revealed, his movements measured and deliberate as those of a conductor preparing an orchestra. "Observe the acoustic properties as I move through the room," he called, his voice carrying differently from various positions. "Note particularly how whispers near the mirrors seem to emanate from the air itself, how the painted ceiling creates phantom echoes that could convince a receptive mind of supernatural presence." As the waltz continued, Whimsy demonstrated the crime's first crucial element. Moving to the gramophone, he manipulated the concealed baffle mechanism while the music played. The effect proved startling. Mrs. Baines, positioned at her linen cupboard, gasped as the sound appeared to cease abruptly, while those within the ballroom could still hear the melody continuing at reduced volume. "Your abrupt cessation, Mrs. Baines, was perfectly accurate from your position," Whimsy explained gently. "Our professor manipulated this baffle at exactly 12 minutes past midnight, creating the illusion that the music had ended while it actually continued for those positioned differently within the room. The demonstration's second phase revealed even more sophisticated preparation. As the waltz reached its final measures, Bunter, following his master's precise timing, allowed the deliberately weakened needle to fail catastrophically. The sharp crack echoed through the ballroom's acoustic chambers like a pistol shot, followed by the scratching of broken steel on wax. "That sound," Whimsy announced as the echoes faded, "combined with Mrs. Thornfield's psychological conditioning, created the perfect murder weapon." She had been trained through decades of correspondence to believe that such signals represented the professor's supernatural guidance, commands for her ultimate artistic expression. But the demonstration's most revelatory moment came when Whimsy approached the largest mirror and, with barely perceptible pressure, caused an entire panel to swing inward on silent hinges. Behind lay a narrow observation platform, complete with speaking grill and clear sight lines to the ballroom's center. "From this position," Whimsy explained, stepping into the concealment, "our professor could observe every movement while remaining invisible. The acoustic properties allow whispered instructions to seem supernatural to someone dancing in the room's center." His voice, emerging from the hidden chamber, seemed to float through the air around the gramophone with eerie precision. The effect on the assembled witnesses was immediate and profound. Even Inspector Grimsby visibly started at the disembodied quality of the sound. The passage communicates with the servant's stair, Whimsy continued, reappearing through a different entrance entirely. No need to touch lock or latch. Our professor could remain throughout the performance, manipulating both acoustic environment and psychological conditioning, then depart through the French windows during the morning's confusion. The complete sequence, demonstrated with mechanical precision, revealed a crime of unprecedented sophistication. Mrs. Thornfield had been murdered not through violence, but through the systematic destruction of her capacity to distinguish reality from elaborate fantasy, culminating in a death that was simultaneously suicide and homicide. Captain Thornfield, who had maintained his skeptical demeanor throughout most of the demonstration, now sat pale and silent as the implications became clear. The crude threats in his correspondence seemed suddenly pathetic compared to the elegant precision of the actual crime. The physical evidence supports this reconstruction completely, Whimsy concluded, indicating the traces of occupancy behind the mirror, tobacco ash, shoe scuffs, and the mechanical apparatus for remote operation of both baffle and timing devices. Someone spent hours in concealment, orchestrating Mrs. Thornfield's psychological state while manipulating the acoustic environment to create the illusion of supernatural guidance. The ballroom, with its mirrors reflecting infinite images of the empty dance floor, seemed suddenly to echo with phantom waltzes and whispered instructions from a professor who had transformed musical instruction into psychological warfare. The locked room mystery had resolved itself with terrible elegance, revealing a murder that was both mechanically precise and psychologically devastating. As the grandfather clock chimed the completion of the fatal hour, Whimsy turned to the assembled company with that particular smile that Parker had learned to associate with approaching revelation. The demonstration had proved the method. Now came the moment for unmasking the perpetrator of this elaborate and chilling crime. The demonstration had revealed the method with devastating precision, but Whimsy's pale eyes now held that particular gleam that Parker had learned to associate with the moment when scattered evidence crystallized into inescapable truth. The ballroom, with its mirrors reflecting phantom dancers and its acoustic secrets laid bare, awaited the final movement in this elaborate symphony of deduction. The question that has haunted this investigation, Whimsy began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man arranging the final pieces of an intricate puzzle, is not merely how such an elaborate crime was executed, but who possessed the unique combination of intimate knowledge, technical expertise, and psychological insight necessary to orchestrate Mrs. Thornfield's willing participation in her own destruction. He moved to the gramophone, his fingers tracing the modified baffle mechanism with reverent attention. This device required not merely mechanical skill, but profound understanding of Mrs. Thornfield's response to specific musical cues, her psychological vulnerabilities, and her deepest emotional needs. Someone who had studied her reactions for decades, who knew precisely how she would respond to particular pressures applied at precisely the right moments. Bunter, positioned near the French windows, produced a leather portfolio containing the evidence they had methodically assembled. The physical evidence speaks with remarkable consistency, Whimsy continued, examining several items through his monocle. The tobacco ash from our observer's platform, not Turkish cigarettes as Captain Thornfield favors, but a distinctive Balkan mixture, pipe tobacco, quite expensive and requiring sophisticated taste to appreciate. He held up a fragment of the beeswax and graphite compound discovered in both the clock mechanism and the gramophone's baffle system. This particular mixture requires knowledge of horological maintenance, the sort of expertise possessed by someone responsible for winding and maintaining the household's timepieces for 30 years. His gaze moved systematically around the assembled company before settling on Meadows, whose composed expression remained as unreadable as ever. The handwriting analysis proves most illuminating, Meadows. The professor's elegant script, when examined under magnification, reveals the same distinctive characteristics as the meticulous penmanship you employ for household inventories. The flourished capitals, the precise spacing, the continental affectations, all carefully adopted to disguise what is fundamentally English domestic handwriting of the highest quality. The butler's only response was a slight inclination of his head, as if acknowledging a compliment on his penmanship. For 20 years, Wimsey continued, his voice gaining momentum, you have cultivated Mrs. Thornfield's psychological dependence with the patience of a master gardener tending a particularly delicate orchid. You understood her loneliness following the Colonel's death, her desperate need for intellectual validation, her artistic pretensions. You fed these hungers systematically, transforming innocent enthusiasm into psychological dependency. He produced one of the professor's letters, its elegant script gleaming in the ballroom's reflected light. The correspondence reveals intimate knowledge of household routines, family dynamics, even the architectural peculiarities of this specific room. Someone who could predict Mrs. Thornfield's every response because they had been studying her reactions for decades, who knew exactly when Agnes would retire, when Mrs. Baines would be occupied with her duties, when the house would settle into its evening rhythm. Parker stepped forward with additional evidence. The paper analysis confirms that these letters were written on stationery available only through special order from Harrods. Expensive paper that suggests both refined taste and London connections. Yet the postmarks show mailings from various locations, suggesting deliberate misdirection to create the illusion of a correspondent who traveled extensively. Wimsey's deduction gathered force as he addressed the crime's psychological dimensions. This was never about inheritance, Meadows. Captain Thornfield's crude threats and gambling debts were mere melodrama compared to your sophisticated manipulation. You, a man of evident education and refined intellect, condemned by circumstance to a life of domestic service, discovered in Mrs. Thornfield's vulnerability an opportunity to exercise the intellectual dominance that society's conventions denied you. The butler's composure showed its first crack, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that suggested Wimsey's analysis had struck home. The professor of the dance was your secret identity, your vehicle for asserting intellectual superiority over those you served. Through this elaborate fiction, you could demonstrate that their supposed refinement was merely vanity, that their artistic pretensions could be manipulated as easily as a marionette's strings. Mrs. Thornfield believed herself an artist achieving transcendence when she was merely dancing to your choreography. Wimsey moved to the observation platform, gesturing toward the speaking grill that had allowed whispered instructions to seem supernatural. From this position, you orchestrated her final performance with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. You witnessed her collapse, the culmination of 20 years' psychological manipulation, before slipping away through the servant's stair, leaving the ballroom locked and the mystery apparently impenetrable. The silence that followed carried the weight of accumulated revelation. Finally, Meadows spoke, his voice carrying the cultured tones that had been hidden beneath decades of deferential service. "She was a fool, my lord," he said quietly, his composure returning with chilling completeness. Utterly susceptible to flattery, desperate for validation she had never earned. I merely provided the guidance she craved, allowing her to achieve what she believed was artistic apotheosis. It was, if I may say so, a composition of considerable elegance. His eyes met Wimsey's with something approaching pride. 20 years of patient cultivation, my lord. A masterpiece of psychological architecture that transformed her greatest passion into the instrument of her own destruction. She died believing herself transcendent, surely a more merciful end than the gradual decay of age and irrelevance she so feared. Inspector Grimsby moved forward with his handcuffs, but Meadows made no attempt at resistance. The unmasking was complete. revealing not a crime of passion or greed, but an elaborate intellectual exercise in human manipulation that had culminated in the perfect psychological murder. The locked ballroom had indeed witnessed a final dance, but the true choreographer had been watching from the shadows all along. The composed facade that had sustained Meadows through 30 years of domestic service began to fracture with the subtle but unmistakable signs of a man watching his life's masterpiece dissected with surgical precision. His hands, which had performed countless tasks with mechanical perfection, trembled almost imperceptibly as Whimsy produced the final piece of damning evidence, the midnight blue gown itself, its spine revealing the clever modifications that had made solitary dressing possible. One observes, Whimsy noted with quiet satisfaction, that someone replaced half the original hooks with concealed press studs, French fashion, allowing the garment to be fastened without assistance. The tailor's chalk from your work table remains on the inner placket, along with what appears to be a small blood stain where you pricked your finger during the alterations. Agnes stared at the treacherous fastenings with dawning horror, while Mrs. Baines made a small sound of wounded betrayal. The evidence was irrefutable. Meadows had spent months preparing for Mrs. Thornfield's final performance, eliminating every obstacle that might have required another person's presence in the ballroom. When Meadows finally spoke, his voice had lost its carefully modulated deference, revealing instead the cultured tones of his true education. "You speak of manipulation as if it were some unprecedented crime," he said, his eyes blazing with sudden intensity. "But what was my entire existence except a prolonged exercise in intellectual submission? Cambridge degree in classics, fluency in 4 languages, published papers on medieval music theory, all rendered meaningless by the simple accident of birth into the wrong social stratum. The transformation was complete now. Gone was the humble servant, replaced by a man whose intelligence had been poisoned by decades of enforced subservience into something brilliant but utterly corrupt. Mrs. Thornfield represented everything I despised about the privileged classes. Born to wealth and position, educated by governesses who knew less Latin than I learned before my 15th birthday. Yet she presumed to discuss art and culture as if her opinions possessed inherent value. Parker stepped closer, his notebook forgotten as he witnessed this extraordinary confession. The professor of the dance was not merely a fictional identity. Meadows continued, his tone taking on the professorial quality that had characterized the mysterious correspondence. He was who I should have been, who I would have been in a just world. Through him I could exercise the intellectual dominance that circumstances had denied me. His hands caressed the modified gramophone mechanism with something approaching tenderness. Each letter was a small masterpiece of psychological manipulation, carefully calibrated to increase her dependence while feeding her vanity. I studied her responses like a scientist examining specimens, refining my techniques until I could predict her reactions with mathematical precision. Agnes pressed herself against the wall, staring at this man she had worked alongside for years, as if seeing him for the first time. 20 years of careful preparation, Meadows continued, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. The correspondence began innocently enough, a small experiment in intellectual superiority. But her pathetic vulnerability, her desperate hunger for validation, drew me into an increasingly elaborate game. "But why murder?" Parker asked quietly. "You had achieved complete psychological dominance." Meadows' expression darkened with something approaching hatred. "Because she began to bore me, Inspector." 20 years of the same responses, the same predictable gratitude, the same pathetic attempts at artistic sophistication. She had served her purpose as an intellectual exercise, but she had become tedious. The admission carried a chilling casualness that made even Whimsy momentarily speechless. This was murder committed from sheer intellectual ennui, the elimination of a human being who had ceased to provide adequate entertainment. The final performance was to be my masterpiece. Meadows whispered, his voice breaking for the first time. She would dance herself to death, believing she was achieving artistic transcendence, never knowing she was merely executing the final movement of my composition. As Inspector Grimsby stepped forward with his handcuffs, Meadows's composure finally cracked completely. The intellectual predator dissolved into something far more pathetic. A bitter, frustrated man whose elaborate revenge against social inequality had consumed both his victim and himself. "She died happy," he murmured as the steel clicked into place. In her final moments, she believed herself transcendent. Surely that was kinder than letting her discover the truth about her precious artistic calling. But even as the words left his lips, Meadows seemed to recognize their hollow quality. The great intellectual game that had consumed 2 decades of his life had revealed itself as nothing more than elaborate cruelty dressed in philosophical pretensions. As they led him away, the ballroom fell silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock, marking time that would continue long after this particular dance of death had ended. The morning light streaming through the ballroom's tall windows seemed to dissolve the theatrical shadows that had concealed 20 years of elaborate deception, transforming the chamber from Gothic stage back into mere Georgian architecture. Whimsy stood contemplating the silent gramophone while Bunter packed their equipment with customary efficiency, each piece nestled in its proper place like evidence of order restored to a disordered world. "Most illuminating case, Charles," Whimsy observed, adjusting his monocle as Inspector Grimsby's motor car disappeared down the gravelled drive with its prisoner. "One finds oneself contemplating the curious relationship between memory and music and how both can be weaponized by those who understand their psychological properties with sufficient precision." Parker nodded thoughtfully. "The systematic nature of it, Peter. 20 years of correspondence designed to isolate and manipulate a lonely widow. It suggests a patience that borders on the inhuman." "Ah, but that's precisely where you err, my dear fellow," Whimsy replied, moving to the French windows. Meadows's crime was profoundly human in its motivations, however elaborate its execution. Intellectual pride wounded by social circumstance, resentment transformed into elaborate revenge. These are emotions as old as civilization itself. Mrs. Thornfield believed herself engaged in artistic transcendence when she was merely performing steps choreographed by another's malice. Agnes, quietly collecting her mistress's effects, looked up with tear-stained eyes. "What becomes of us now, my lord?" "Captain Thornfield inherits, naturally," Whimsy replied gently, "and I rather suspect his gambling debts will prove less catastrophic than his correspondence suggested. Grief has a curious way of clarifying one's priorities, and losing a stepmother to elaborate murder tends to put financial difficulties into proper perspective." The observation proved prescient. The captain had spent the morning arranging not for asset sales, but for establishing modest pensions for the remaining staff. His crude threats now seemed like mere bluster from a man too proud to admit genuine affection for his stepmother. "Music possesses an almost supernatural power to evoke memory and emotion," Whimsy continued, fingers trailing across the gramophone's brass horn. Meadows understood this instinctively, using melody as both lure and weapon. "The most dangerous deceptions, Charles, are often those we construct for ourselves." He merely exploited Mrs. Thornfield's self-delusion, turning her greatest comfort into her undoing. Bunter appeared with the leather valise. "The motor is prepared, my lord." "Indeed. I find myself suddenly eager for London's honest chaos after this exercise in rural sophistication." Whimsy moved toward the entrance, then paused. "The locked room mystery has always held particular fascination because it suggests the impossible. Death without agency, effect without cause. Yet the solution invariably reveals not supernatural intervention, but human ingenuity applied to destructive ends." As they walked through corridors lined with suspicious-looking Thornfield ancestors, Whimsy reflected on murder's curious democracy. 20 years of patient correspondence, elaborate mechanical preparations, psychological manipulation of the subtlest sort, all to accomplish what a simple push down the stairs might have achieved in seconds. There's something almost admirable in such dedication to intellectual complexity, however misguided its application. The Daimler waited in the forecourt, chrome gleaming in strengthening sunlight. As Bunter stowed their luggage, Whimsy took one final look at the Georgian facade. Each case provides fresh insight into the infinite capacity of human beings to surprise themselves with their own behavior, Charles. Mrs. Thornfield danced herself to death believing she was achieving artistic immortality, while Meadows destroyed both his victim and himself, pursuing intellectual dominance. Parker settled into the passenger seat with visible relief. The whole business has left me rather unsettled about human relationships. But that's precisely what makes detective work endlessly fascinating, Whimsy replied, starting the engine. As the Daimler wound through Gloucestershire countryside, he hummed a Bach passage, music requiring no audience, seeking no validation, concealing no deadly secrets. As the Greeks observed, know thyself, though they neglected to mention that knowing is rather a moving target. Add a gramophone and an echoing room, and one has metaphysics on tap. Behind them, Thornfield Manor settled into respectable silence, ready to resume its small hypocrisies, while phantom dancers waltzed no more.